The Nigerian Security and Civil Defense Corps has warned house owners in Rivers State against using their properties for illegal oil bunkering activities. This follows the discovery of another residential compound that had been converted to a storage facility for stolen petroleum products. And senior correspondent Uchekuru Okoro reports.
The NSCDC recently sealed two private properties that were converted to dump sites for illegally refined crude oil in Port Harcourt. Barely 1 month later, the command's anti-vandal unit has uncovered another one in Alu community of Ikwere local government area. This compound is one of the biggest so far since the last of illegally refined crude adopted this strategy to avoid suspicion. More than 200 storage tanks were found, and some of them contained a total of 35,000 liters of suspected stolen diesel. The next step is the forfeiture of all seized property and exhibits to the federal government.
All the exhibits and all the premises that were used for illegal bunkering shall be charged to court, and the court, we're waiting for the court to give forfeiture order. And when they give the forfeiture, auctioneers are going to come from Abuja to auction those properties. That's where we are heading to now.
Going forward, the NSCDC warns that landlords or occupants of residential buildings that are found to be involved in crude oil theft will be prosecuted.
The landlords are aware, so that the landlord that we should blame, because a tenant cannot take such a big premises, bigger than this premises, for that kind of activity. So the landlord is culpable, and we are looking for the landlords. So we can also charge them to court for allowing their premises to be used for illegality.
The command also paraded 16 suspects for alleged illegal dealings in petroleum products.
The business that I do is illegal business. I went to carry his product. He sent me to go and carry product. I went to go and carry it. I can't go and steal when I'm hungry. That's the reason why I do that business.
The Nigerian Navy Ship Pathfinder arrested 8 of these suspects and handed them over to the NSCDC for further investigation and possible prosecution. Uche Okoro, TVC News, Port Harcourt.
And to other stories, the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, Disaster Management and Social Development says it plans to adopt the recently approved National Flood Emergency Preparedness and Response Plan to mitigate the effects of the flood disaster. Now, 31 states and the FCT have been gravely impacted by the 2022 floods, affecting over 1.4 million people, with about 500 deaths recorded. This year's floods have been marked the worst the country ever witnessed. Moyo Thomas reports.
The impact of the flood across the country is already biting hard. The Lokoja Bridge, which is the link road between the north and south, has been flooded, making commuting difficult. This has greatly affected trade, as exchange of goods between the north and the south is now an Herculean task. It has also resulted in long queues in fuel stations in Abuja and beyond. While people are still groaning under this discomfort, the flood has wrought even worse disasters in some states and communities.
Another flooding issue.
The Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs briefs journalists on the issues of the flood. He says already 790,254 people are displaced and moved out of their locations. 1,546 persons among the displaced were injured.
Furthermore, 44,099 houses were partially damaged, 45,249 houses totally damaged, and 76,168 hectares of farmland partially damaged, while 70,566 hectares of farmland are completely destroyed by the deluge.
The National Emergency Management Agency have been able to provide relief materials to support over 315,000 of the displaced persons. Worse still are the farmlands affected by the floods. This may result in food insecurity in the year to come. The Permanent Secretary says the economic loss cannot be ascertained as the rains are not yet over, but an assessment of loss to farmlands, poultry facilities, livestock and fisheries is ongoing. Many at this briefing wonder why Nigeria always waits for these flood disasters to happen before actions are taken. But the Permanent Secretary corrects this notion, insisting states were already pre-warned about impending floods.
All the meetings have been held between Mr. President and governors, and the minister has attended meetings with the governors to tell them the specific villages and communities. I have all the exhibits of letters.
He assured that the government is making all effort to mitigate the impact, but would need public support to achieve this. Moya Thomas, TVC News, Abuja.
And a campaign has now been launched to advocate for climate change actions to be implemented in Nigeria and other African countries. It is meant to address the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations. Kemi Balogun has more details.
Women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change, amplifying existing gender inequalities and posing unique threats to their livelihoods, health, and safety. Over the years, efforts to fight climate change and assist vulnerable countries to cope with its impact have intensified. But these impacts are still being felt by everyone, particularly the vulnerable groups.
As African women and girls, we strongly believe that we have issues when it comes to the issues of climate change, and therefore we have mobilized the whole of African continent, and we have the Charter of Demands to present to the Conference of Parties, but also to the UNFCCC to say that this is what we want on the African continent. We want to happen.
As the impact of climate change continues to take a toll on vulnerable continents across the world, urgent actions are needed to reverse the trend to pave way for a more sustainable development. This meeting, championed by the Women Environmental Program and Christian Aid, wants to make this happen through a list of 6 expectations and demands ahead of the United Nations 27th Climate Change Conference.
At the same time, we want to see how can women especially be at the negotiating table, because if you look at most of the continent, especially in Africa, the national focal points that we have are just men, and we are talking about decisions, we're talking about policies. If you are not at the policy table, if you are not at the negotiating table, you will not be able to understand favorably the issues that affect the gender concern. And so these are several issues that we are going to take to COP27.
All regions of the world are affected by the negative impacts of climate change, but developing nations are mostly affected due to their low adaptive capacity. The push here is to ensure that this situation changes by raising voices at the Climate Change Summit taking place November in Egypt. Kemi Balogun, TVC News, Abuja.